Hi, my name is Rachel Deck, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects.
In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world.
Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
Some queens, especially single queens, found themselves attacked to a greater degree. When Elizabeth was ruling England, King Philip II of Spain thought he would be easily unseating her and restoring Catholicism to England.
Tell Philip, I fear neither him, nor his priests, nor his armies.
But then the War of the Spanish Armada suggested history would take a different course.
Tell him if he wants to shake his little fist at us, we're ready to give him such a bite he'll wish he'd kept his hands in his pockets.
So Philip had at the time amassed what was the greatest fleet ever, 130 ships.
There is a wind coming, madam, that will sweep away your pride.
Despite this, Elizabeth outmaneuvered him.
I too can command the wind, sir! I have a hurricane in me that will strip Spain bare if you dare to try me!
The perception that the queen would be easy to unseat may have led other monarchs to attack them.
The story of Queen Elizabeth is just one example in European history of how female leaders were no less likely to engage in warfare than their male counterparts. In fact, as we'll soon discover, the research shows that women leaders in this period of history were more likely to go to war than male leaders. My name is Aishwarya Rajay, and in this episode of Root of Conflict, I spoke with Dr. Oeindrila Dube, the Philip K. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies here at the Harris School of Public Policy. Professor Dube recently co-authored a paper titled Queens, which examines the question of whether states led by women are more or less prone to conflict than states led by men. Professor Dube walks us through the empirical approaches used in this research, as well as how to interpret these findings within the broader context of the study of gender and conflict. Professor Dube, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to start off, what led you to do this research? Specifically, what led you to want to answer the question of whether states experienced more peace under female leadership versus male leadership?
I was actually inspired by the work of Esther Duflo, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. She had done some work with co-authors that showed that when there are female leaders in a development context, you actually end up getting different policies. So she was looking in the context of India, and she was looking at Indian villages that were ruled by female pradhans, and finding that when you had female leadership, you had a different set of outcomes than when you had male leaders. I thought this was fascinating, and I started thinking a lot about whether this could be applied to the context of conflict. Would we observe that areas led by women actually display different conflict behavior than areas led by men? As I started thinking about this, I realized this is a question that has to be answered at a different level than a village. It has to be really examined at the national level because most conflict policy, in a broad sense, is set at that level. That, in turn, led me to the challenge of thinking about how would you identify a causal effect of female leadership on war? Because women tend to come to rule during certain time periods, or electorates that are willing to elect them into office might have certain views that also influence conflict. So it seemed challenging to disentangle this in the modern day era. This is what actually led me to look in the historical context, where I thought conditions of hereditary succession would actually enable us to come up with a credible answer to this question of whether female leadership affects war.
And just given the popular notion that women are inherently less violent than men and that women-led states are bound to experience more peace and prosperity, were you surprised by your own findings that showed that having a female leader increased the chance of going to war by 39 percentage points during this almost 450-year time period in European history that you examined?
I thought it would be a fascinating question to answer precisely because so many leading thought makers of our time have made very strong claims that female leaders will be more conciliatory than male leaders. Francis Fukuyama has even said that the recent period of democratic peace between the world's developed countries can be attributed to female leadership. Steven Pinker has written that men are responsible for all the wars and genocides in the world. When I read these claims, it really reinforced my desire to want to answer this question. And I suspected that the answer we would find is not necessarily one that, female leadership leads to peace. I thought we might find there's no difference. In that regard, I was surprised to see that the effect actually goes in the opposite direction, and that states led by women, historically in the context of Europe, found themselves participating in wars 39 percentage points more, as you highlighted.
And it would be great if you could just walk us through some of the main variables that you used in your statistical analysis as you went through this research. I know one of them was you controlled for the number of siblings that previous monarchs had, and you also had the firstborn male variable. I mean, how did some of those factors and some of those variables contribute to your overall findings?
Yeah, let me give you a bit of an overview of the approach that we used for the analysis. So I mentioned earlier that we focused on Europe under conditions of hereditary succession, and we did that because essentially hereditary succession, under those conditions, it was largely accidents of birth that would determine who came to power. Specifically, if the previous monarchs happened to have a firstborn child who was male, you were much more likely to get a king the next period. Conversely, if they had a firstborn child who happened to be female, you were much more likely to get a queen in the next period. If the previous monarchs had a sister to who the throne could pass, you were also more likely to get a queen the next period. Notice that these forces of gender, such as whether the previous monarchs happened to have a firstborn child who was male, are largely determined by nature. They're as good as random. So in essence, during this period, history gave us a series of natural experiments that we could exploit. So how did we exploit this natural experiment? Well, we actually used these two gender forces, whether the previous monarchs had a firstborn child who was male and whether they had a sister, as instruments for whether or not a woman was in power. So this gave us exogenous variation that we could use in instrumental variables framework to look at the causal effect of female leadership on war. We also included other control variables. For example, we included polity fixed effects, which meant we were basically looking within a particular polity, like within Spain or within England, and looking at time periods in which within that polity there was a female leader versus a male leader. So this takes care of a lot of potential confounds by controlling for any time invariant features of a polity that may happen to be correlated with conflict outcomes. We also control for decade fixed effects because there's just decades where conflict happened to be higher. And we also controlled for the number of total siblings that the previous monarchs had. This is primarily motivated by the use of the sibling instrument. Notice that you might be worried that the chances of a previous monarch having a sister may be higher if 2 periods ago those monarchs had a whole pile of children, and so their just are a higher chance of also having one of them be female. Plus, then you would get, from the angle of this period, a whole bunch of aunts and uncles who might also be duking it out for the throne, fighting over the throne. This would create the worry just that the presence of all of those other types of aunts and uncles running around would itself create fights over succession. So we wanted to control out for that effect, and we did that by controlling for the presence of these aunts and uncles.
In addition to these controls, you also had to make sure that you would address potential small sample bias in this experiment, especially because you were looking at 29 queens over this period. So can you talk briefly about some of the methods that you used to reconcile that?
Absolutely. So when we put this data together, there was no pre-existing data that tracked the genealogy of all the polities from 1480 to 1913, which is the time period in which we were working, and that also considered the genealogy of all these polities as well as the extent of war they experienced. So we put all of this data together. We actually coded Wright's epic book, A Study of War, and matched all of that to the genealogy data to come up with our sample. So in the sample, we have 18 polities that have at least once had a queen historically. But we're able to track all of these 18 polities for the entire time period that they're in existence. So we get a very long sample of 3,586 polity year observations. And we use all the years of data, but we are looking at time periods in which a queen is ruling versus a king is ruling. So that's the overarching view of our sample. Now, within these 18 polities, there are 193 distinct reigns of monarchs, distinct sets of rulers who are ruling at a given point in time. And 18% of them, or 34 of these reigns, are ruled by queens. And within those 34 reigns, there are 29 distinct queens, as you highlight. So this is not a large sample. So what are the ways in which we actually address this small sample issue? We have two approaches. The first is we want to make sure that there's no one outlying queen who is very aggressive, who is driving the entire effect. So we take a series of steps to look at this. We drop each polity one at a time. Then we drop each queen one at a time. Then we drop two randomly chosen queens, two at a time. And we verify that none of the estimates are sensitive to any particular outlier. That's one approach. The other approach is anytime you have small number of polities, like in our case we have 18 polities, and we want to essentially make sure we're getting inference right by doing something called clustering our standard errors on the level of the polity. Because in general, we think the extent of war is going to be correlated over time within a polity, and we want to control for that effect when we're doing inference. So we cluster our standard errors at the level of the polity, but anytime you have very few clusters, in our case we have 18 clusters, and that's smaller than 40, and if you have smaller than 40 clusters, you can undertake a procedure called the wild bootstrap procedure for the standard errors, where it's essentially as if you're resampling your data over and over again. And using this adjustment, we are able to show that the effects remain in place after appropriately using this wild bootstrap procedure. So that's the other way in which we address the small sample bias that can affect inference.
Mm-hmm. So in addition to that, I would imagine when you're doing these very robust statistical analyses, when you're studying something like gender dynamics within political structures, you would also have to take into account factors like social norms and discrimination against women. How, as a researcher, are there any challenges that you face in taking into account these very important factors that aren't necessarily as quantifiable as some of the variables that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think in our case, social norms played a big role in the